Introduction. The Brothers Karamazov is a joyful book. Readers who know what it is about may find this an intolerably whimsical statement. It does have moments of joy, but they are only moments. The rest is greed, lust, squalor, unredeemed suffering, and a sometimes terrifying darkness. But the book is joyful in an other sense, in its energy and curiosity, in its formal inventiveness, in the mastery of its writing, and therefore, finally, in its vision. This paradox is not peculiar to the Brothers Karamazov. What is peculiar to Dostoyevsky is the intensifying of the contrast. The manner of the Brothers Karamazov, as opposed to its matter, is essentially comic, and its humor erupts at the most unexpected moments. It is a comedy of style, which again paradoxically in no way detracts from the realism, in the higher sense that Dostoyevsky claimed as the principle of his art. The seriousness of art is not the same as the seriousness of philosophy or the seriousness of injustice. The difference which Dostoyevsky understood very well has sometimes escaped the commentators. Perhaps from a similar mistaking of Dostoyevsky's intention, previous translators of the Brothers Karamazov into English have revised, corrected, or smoothed over his idiosyncratic prose, removing much of the humor and distinctive voicing of the novel. We have made this new translation in the belief that a truer rendering of Dostoyevsky's style would restore missing dimensions to the book. The juxtaposing of extremes that one finds in the Brothers Karamazov was also a mark of Dostoyevsky's life. 3 years he spent working on the novel, which was completed in 1880, were comparatively the most settled he was to know. In 1871, at the age of 50, he had returned to Russia after 4 years of voluntary exile abroad. His young wife, Anna Grigorievna, took over his practical affairs and in 1873 became his publisher, which for the first time brought him some financial stability. In 1876, Dostoyevsky and his wife purchased the house they had been renting in the quite provincial town of Satarya, Russia, a setting that transferred into the Brothers Karamazov. Their domestic life was disrupted by one tragic event: the death of their 3-year-old son, Alexei, in 1878, which also left a deep mark on the novel. But as an author and as a public figure, Dostoyevsky was the highest point of his career. Prominent friends introduced him at court. The Emperor Alexander II asked him to be the spiritual guide of his younger sons, the Grand Duke Sergei and Pavel. He made the acquaintance of the future Alexander III and presented him with copies of his works. He was a frequent guest at aristocratic salons in Petersburg. The Brothers Karamazov, which was appearing serially, was being read and discussed with great excitement. In Moscow on June 8, 1880, he delivered an address on the poet Pushkin, which brought him enormous public acclaim. His funeral 8 months later, in the words of his biographer Macholsky, turned into an historical event. 30,000 people accompanied his coffin, 72 delegations carried wreaths, 15 corps took part in his procession. Some 3 decades earlier, however, on April 23, 1849, Dostoyevsky had been arrested along with other members of a secret utopian society and sentenced to death. The Emperor Nikolai I, father of Alexander II, changed the sentence but ordered that the reprieve be announced only at the last minute. After 8 months in the Petropavlsky fortress, the young writer was taken out to what he thought would be his execution. He described the event in a letter to his brother Mikhail. Today, December 22, we were driven to Semyonsky parade ground. There, the death sentence was read to us all. We were given the cross to kiss. Swords were broken over our heads and our final toilet was arranged. Then 3 of us were set against the post so as to carry out the execution. We were summoned in threes, Consequently, I was in the second group, and there was not more than a minute left to live. I remembered you, my brother, and all yours at the last minute. You alone were in my mind, and it was only then that I realized how much I love you, my dearest brother. I also succeeded in embracing Pelchev and Durov, who were beside me, and bade farewell to them. Finally, the retreat was sounded. Those who had been tied to the post were led back, and they read us that His Imperial Majesty granted us our lives. Thereupon followed the actual sentence. Brother, I'm not depressed, and haven't lost spirit. Life everywhere is life. Life is in ourselves and not in the external. There will be people near me, and to be a human being among human beings, and remain one forever no matter what misfortunes befall. Not to become depressed and not to falter, that is what life is. Therein lies in its tasks. I have come to recognize this. This idea has entered into my flesh and blood. Yes, it's true, that head which created lived by the highest life of art, which acknowledged and had come to know the highest demands of the spirit. That head has been cut from my shoulders. Memory remains, and the images I have created, and still not molded in flesh, they will leave their harsh mark on me. It is true, but my heart has left me, and the same flesh and blood which likewise can love and suffer and desire and remember. And this is, after all, life. Well, goodbye, brother. Do not grieve for me. Never until now have such rich and healthy stores of spiritual life throbbed in me. I have quoted at length from this extraordinary letter not only for its own sake, but because certain quality of its spirit and even some of its word were to reappear 30 years later in the speeches of Dmitri Karamazov, and because it expresses so clearly the irrational value of life and purifying effect of suffering. Central themes of Dostoyevsky's later work, which he knew first of all from experience. The actual sentence he received was 8 years of penal servitude, which the emperor reduced to 4 years, followed by exile into the ranks. It was 10 years before Dostoyevsky was granted permission to return to Petersburg. Conditions in the prison of Omsk, where he served the first part of his sentence, were much worse, as we know from his letters, than he described them in the fictionalized notes from the Dead House, 1860. These were of terrible solitude for him, but also of self-judgment and the beginning of spiritual regeneration. On leaving prison, he wrote to Andy von Wisena, the wife of a political exile, who had given him a copy of the Gospels. Not because you are religious, but because I myself have experienced and felt it keenly. I will tell you that in such moments, one thirsts like parched grass for faith and find it precisely because truth shines in misfortune. I will tell you regarding myself that I am a child of the age, a child of non-belief and doubt up till now, and even I know it until my coffin closes. What terrible torments this thirst to believe has cost me and still costs me, becoming stronger in my soul. The more there is in me of contrary reasoning, and yet sometimes God sent me moments in which I utterly at peace. The coexistence of faith and unbelief indeed remained with Dostoyevsky all his life. Its final artistic expression appears in the brother Karamazov in the opposed figures of the elder Zosima and Grand Inquisitor. Dostoyevsky met the Christ of the Gospel in the prison of Omsk. He also met there a young man named Ilinsky, who was serving a 20-year sentence for parricide. He described him in notes from the Dead House. All the time that I lived with him, he was in the most excellent, in the most cheerful frame of mind. This was a flighty, light-headed individual, irresponsible in the highest degree, although by no means a fool. I never noticed any particular cruelty in him. He did not believe Ilyinsky was guilty of the crime. Later he learned that the man had been cleared. After serving 10 years of his sentence, the story of this life already ruined in the time of its youth under such a terrible sentence eventually became the subject of the Brothers Karamazov, or as the narrator of the novel says, the external side of it. This brief account of two moments from Dostoevsky's life may be enough to suggest that he knew the extremes of Russian society and its unresolved conflicts, as no other writer could have known them. He knew them objectively, and he also knew them within himself, far from resolving these conflicts in some higher synthesis. In his later work, he expanded and deepened them, transforming them finally into a universal human drama. The Brothers Karamazov is much more than the account of murder, an investigation, and a trial, but it is primarily that, and the story is told with such perfect pacing and in such bold stroke that it absorbs almost all of the reader's attention. Structurally, this is the most symmetrical of Dostoevsky novels. Dmitry Karamazov stands in the dark at the exact center of it. He is the central man, impulsive and poetic. The child of his first father marriage. He has two half-brothers who are equally his opposites, the atheist intellectual Ivan and the quite novice Alyosha. The passions that led to the murder involved Dmitry's relations with two women. The victim of the murder in his father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, the wicked and sentimental old profligate who has passed on to all three of his sons. The earthy force of Karamazov's is enigmatic vitality. And there is Samedrikov, Fyodor Pavlovich Lackey, who is rumored to be his illegitimate son. The conflict within this nice little family are tightly wound in the first half of the novel, to be released with all their consequences in the second half. The idea stated by the elder Josima that each of us is guilty before all and for all is fully embodied in the fates of Karamazovs. The circumstances, as simply as I have described them, are already charged with dramatic potential, which Dostoevsky enhances by his methods of composition. Narrative time is extremely condensed in the novel. The action takes place over a period of several months, but of those moments only the events of a few days are actually described. Physical space is also restricted. Most of the scene take place in small or crowded rooms. What there is of natural description is largely symbolic. A dark crossroads, a pathless forest, flowers falling asleep in the hermitage garden at night. The greater part of the novel is made up of dialogue and monologue. Hence, the larger scale of Dostoevsky characters. Their way of emerging from the book, so much so that commentators have often argued or agreed with them as if they were quite independent of their author. They are not representative social types or individuals, but inwardly free persons. Dostoevsky seems intent on bringing together in one place as many contradictory people as possible. The inappropriate gathering of Book 2 and the trial of Book 12 are examples. But the novel as a whole is formed in the same way. Character and ideas do not evolve or develop. They appear simultaneously in decisive moment. The style of the Brothers Karamazov is based on the spoken, not the written word. Dostoevsky composed it in voices. We know from his notebooks and letters how he gathered the phrases, mannerism, verbal tics from which a Fyodor Pavlovich or a Samedrikov would emerge, and how he would try out these voices, writing many pages of dialogue that would never be used in the novel. The publication of his notebook in the 1930s finally dispelled the old prejudice that Dostoevsky was a careless and indifferent stylist. All the oddities of his prose are deliberate. They are a sort of learned ignorance, a willed imperfection of artistic means that is essential to his vision. I will give some examples here which will also suggest how and why we have made this translation. The first voice to be heard in the Brothers Karamazov is the narrator's. Needless to say, he is not Dostoyevsky. The brief note from the author at the start of the book, which the author himself calls superfluous, accomplishes a number of important things by way of introduction. But above all, it introduces us to the whole stylistic complex of the narrator voice, his hedged assertions. One thing perhaps is rather doubtless, his rare poetic flights, some kind of flooding wind, his repetition emphatic or humorous. Being at a loss to resolve these questions, I am resolved to leave them without any resolution. His idiosyncratic use of such words as even, almost, some, and a battery of indefinite expressions, as if apparently, his mixed diction and sometimes wandering syntax. He has a penchant for compound modifiers, which he often forms incorrectly. At one point, he writes, Ivan Fyodorovich was convinced beyond doubt of his complete and extremely ill condition. Among his most common tics is the fused cliché, as when he refers to the monk from Obdorsk as the distant visitor, fusion of visitor from far away and distant land. He will get stuck on a particular word, repeat it 5 times in half a page and then never use it again. His sentences lead to flounder most when he is most serious, notably when he talks about Alyosha Karamazov, but he can be quite pointed when he's quivering somehow he does not like. For instance, Pyotr Alexandrovich Myosov, and within his scope, which is that of an amateur writer and more of a talker than a writer, he has his own artistry. He often uses internal rhymes as assonance, splintered and scattered. He sometimes allows himself triple alliteration, a weak, wailing, woeful voice. There are stretches when the person of the author seems to recede and be replaced by a more conventional, omniscient narrator. But his voice will suddenly re-emerge in a phrase or half-phrase, giving an unexpected double tone or double point of view to the passage. Dostoyevsky is famous for his pathetic scenes, yet there is perhaps no such scene in the Brothers Karamazov that is not stylistically counterpointed and lightened by the narrator. Captain Snegirov's house is described in the prelude to one of the most pathetic scenes in the novel as a decrepit, lopsided little house with only 3 windows looking out onto the street, and a dirty courtyard in the middle of which a cow stood solitarily. In another scene, Snegirov's cry, "Mama, let me kiss your hand," is followed by the comment, "Her husband jumped close to her at once, carried out his intention. Be prepared for anything." The Moscow doctor pronounces, after informing Snegerov that his son is going to die. Then, lowering his eyes, he himself prepared to step across the threshold to the carriage. The novel is a tissue of such moments. By making his narrator a writer, and a writer with such pronounced personal mannerism, Dostoyevsky stresses the writedness of the novel. But perhaps unexpectedly, this has the effect of heightening the reality of the events and people he is writing about, of detaching them somewhat from the word. There is indeed no absolute authorial voice in the Brother Karamazov. Every scene is narrated from at least some personal angle, and where the narrator seems effaced, we find that his voice has shaded into the equally distinct verbal element of the character he is describing. These transitions are masterfully done. For example, there is the moment when Dmitry Karamazov is standing in his father's garden just before the murder and sees the old man lean out the window. Mitya watched from the side and did not move. The whole of the old man's profile, which he found so loathsome, the whole of his drooping Adam's apple, his hooked nose, smiling in sweet expectation, his lips, all was brightly lit from the left by slanting light of the lamp shining from the room. Not only the thoughts, but even the style of the passage with its misplaced clause are Mitya's. We suddenly hear him speaking through the narrator. Each major character in the novel has a distinct way of speaking. Dostoyevsky was not interested in typical regional or class difference of expression, as many writers of his time were. What he sought in the voicing of his character was the singular expression of the person. He delighted in the richness of spoken language, its playfulness, its happy mistakes, its revealing quirks and peculiarities. The prosecutor, Ippolit Krylovich, for instance, says precisely all the time, and finally infects Alyosha with it. The attorney, Fetyukovich, habitually says robbed, and he means stolen, and at one point declares 3 of the 5 possible suspects in the murder completely irresponsible. Expressing his surprise to the investigators, Dmitri, who is a word drunk but uneducated man, says, "I'm struck to the epidermis myself." But these examples do no more than hint at the comedy of style that pervades the Brothers Karamazov. Life is full of the comic and is only majestic in its inner sense, Dostoevsky wrote to a friend in 1879. He was talking about Book 6, The Russian Monk, which he had just finished, but the comment is revealing of the novel as a whole. It may surprise some readers to learn that the Brothers Karamazov is also a comic novel. Dostoevsky is often described as a dark and brooding man, and his novels have been called novel tragedies. There is some truth to that, but it can be misleading. The darkness in the Brothers Karamazov is real darkness, the darkness of evil, not a product of the author's state of mind. And the brightness that is, the lightness is also real. It is rooted in the word, the ambiguous expression of human freedom, not in any uplifting ideology. The comedy of style in the novel embodies moment and joy. It reveals the limits of language, but also the freedom of language. One might almost say the freedom from language. The Brothers Karamazov is, among many other things, a novel about word in all senses, from the incarnate word of God to the emptiest banality. In the process of its composition, it seems to have swallowed a small library. It is full of quotations, imitations, allusions. Its characters are not only speakers, most of them are also writers. They write letters, articles, poems, pamphlets, tracts, memoirs, suicide notes. They perform, make speeches, tell jokes, they preach and confess. Words addressed, received, remembered, forgotten, carry an enormous weight in the novel and have an incalculable effect. Words from an element between matter and spirit in which people live and move each other. Words spoken at one point are repeated later by other speakers, as recollections or unconscious echoes. The voice of the elder Josima, long dead brother, comes back in the elder's last conversation. The dead elder's voice is heard again by Alyosha and speaks through him. In an uncanny moment during the trial, the voice of Samedrikov begins to sound to the words of prosecutor. Ivan's voice echoes in Liza Kokalkov, Rakitin's in Kolya Krasotkin. The tones of Fyodor Pavlovich are heard again from the devils in Ivan's nightmare. In a curious doubling, words similar to the elder Josima begin to come out of attorney Fetyukovich, but devoid of meaning. The living element of speech is a counterpart of Josima's assertion that each of us is guilty before all and for all. The word that speaks, the person says more than the person knows. It can only be heard by others. It is a dramatic in the highest sense, and the drama is played out in the Brothers Karamazov with all its negative variations on the lie, fiction, error, ambiguity, and silence. The community of speech is simultaneous. The word of the deed are heard by the living. The word of the past are heard in the present. The word bears within itself not only in the possibility of the lie, but also the possibility of memory, and much emphasis is placed on what a person is given to remember. Remembrance is the central theme of the elder Zosima talks and homilies, which were written down from memory by Alyosha Karamazov. The author asserts that Alyosha is the hero of the novel. Many commentators have disagreed with him, as he suspected they might. They find Alyosha pale and unrealized as a character, too slight to bear the weight of the positive message Dostoyevsky wanted him to carry. But why, I wonder, would he give such a message to a young man of 20 who hardly has an original idea in his head? Alyosha seems little more than a reactor to events. His opinions and judgment consist almost entirely of things other than just said to him, and are quite often wrong or absurdly out of place when he utters them. Dostoyevsky obviously knew this. His critics, who expected something else, overlooked the delicacy which he allows us to laugh at his hero. Alyosha is a novice in more than one sense, a novice monk when we meet him, and a novice human being as well. He has a compelling directness, which comes from humility. He is often called an angel, and within the intrigues of the novel he has the function of an angelo, a messenger in the most literal sense. He carries messages, letters, requests from one character to the other. He is not much of a speaker, but he is a hearer of words, and he is almost the only one in the novel who can hear. That is his great gift. The word can come to life in him. Alyosha is saved at his darkest moment by his memory of the elder Zosima's voice, as Zosima was saved by the memory of his brother's voice. At the end of the novel, in his speech at Stone, Alyosha hoped to pass his saving word to the schoolboys. Memory is the motive of this final episode, which starts from Alyosha's sudden recollection of his talk with Captain Snigorov and ends by evoking the prayer of memory eternal for the dead boy Alyosha. It is Alyosha's first homily, earnest and unoriginal, but counterpointed by a gentle comedy of style that lifts it into a new light. Richard Pevear.